The winter wind cut through the darkness like a knife. It was December 1943, and the war had turned the world into a frozen nightmare. In a small corner of Eastern Europe, near the German-Soviet border, snow covered everything. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees. Soldiers on both sides struggled to survive, but the fighting never stopped. Captain James Morrison stood outside his tent, watching his breath turn to fog in the cold air. He commanded the supply operations for 50,000 Allied soldiers. His job was simple but brutal: keep the army fed. But nothing about this war was simple anymore. The supply trucks had not arrived in 3 days. German forces had destroyed the roads and bridges during their retreat. Morrison's food warehouses were almost empty. By his calculations, the army had enough food for maybe 2 more days. After that, 50,000 men would start to starve. He had sent urgent messages to headquarters, but the response was always the same: no help was coming soon. That night, Allied forces launched a surprise raid on a German supply depot 15 miles away. Morrison did not expect much from it. The Germans usually destroyed their supplies before retreating. But he was wrong. At dawn, trucks rolled into camp carrying prisoners and captured equipment. Among the items was a German field kitchen, complete with pots, pans, and some basic supplies. Morrison counted the supplies with growing disappointment. There was barely enough food for 500 men, let alone 50,000. That the prisoners were lined up in the cold morning light. Most were young soldiers who looked relieved to be captured. They were tired of fighting and glad to be alive. But one prisoner stood out from the others. Hans Weber was 45 years old, much older than the average soldier. He had gray hair and kind eyes that seemed out of place in a war zone. He wore a cook's apron under his military coat. When the guards searched him, they found no weapons, only a small notebook filled with handwritten recipes. Morrison interviewed each prisoner briefly. When Hans's turn came, the older man stood straight despite his exhaustion. "Name and rank," Morrison said in German. He had learned the language before the war. "Hans Weber, field cook." "No rank," Hans replied. His voice was calm and steady. "A cook?" Morrison raised an eyebrow. "How long have you been cooking for the German army?" 2 years, sir. Before the war, I worked in restaurants in Berlin and Vienna." Morrison was about to dismiss him when an idea struck. It was a desperate idea, probably a stupid idea, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Can you cook for large numbers?" Morrison asked. Hans nodded. "I have been feeding 3,000 soldiers every day for 6 months." Morrison's mind raced. 3,000 was not 50,000, but it was something. "We have a food shortage," he said carefully. "Our supplies are running low. Can you help?" Hans looked surprised. "You want a German prisoner to cook for Allied soldiers?" "I want anyone who can help keep my men from starving," Morrison said. "Can you do it or not?" Hans thought for a moment. "Sir, I can feed your soldiers. But I will need to cook my way, with my methods. You may think my methods are strange." "Strange how?" Morrison asked. "I use everything. Potato peels, stale bread, wild plants from the forest, bones that others throw away. I waste nothing. In Germany, we learned to stretch every bit of food because supplies were short on the Eastern Front." Morrison's officers, who were listening nearby, started to laugh. Major Thompson, a career soldier from Texas, spoke up. "Captain, you cannot be serious. This man wants to feed our boys garbage. Potato peels? Wild plants? That is prison food." Lieutenant Parker agreed. "It sounds ridiculous, sir. Our men deserve better than scraps." Hans remained calm. "I understand your concern, but I have fed thousands of soldiers this way. They stayed healthy and strong. The food tastes good, fills the stomach, and gives energy. It only sounds ridiculous until you try it." Morrison looked at his food inventory reports again. The numbers were clear and brutal. In 2 days, his army would be in serious trouble. He could wait for supply trucks that might never come. Or he could take a chance on this strange German cook with his ridiculous recipe. "Here is the deal," Morrison said finally. "Tomorrow, you will cook for 5,000 soldiers. That is your test. If the food is good and the men do not get sick, we will talk about feeding the whole army. If it fails, you go back to the prisoner camp." "Understood." Hans nodded. "I will need a team of helpers and access to the surrounding forest." "The forest," Thompson said with disbelief. "What are you going to do? Cook trees?" "There are wild herbs and plants in winter forests that most people do not know about," Hans explained. "They add nutrition and flavor. I learned this from a chef who survived the siege of Leningrad. He taught me how to keep people alive when there is almost nothing to eat. Morrison had heard about the siege of Leningrad. The German army had surrounded the Russian city for nearly 900 days. Over 1 million people died, mostly from starvation. If someone had survived that and learned to cook from it, maybe their knowledge was worth listening to. You will have your team and your herbs, Morrison decided. But guards will watch you. If this is some kind of trick, you will regret it. No tricks, Captain, Hans said quietly. I just want to do what I know how to do. A hungry soldier is a suffering soldier, no matter what flag he serves. That night, Hans sat in a guarded tent, writing in his notebook by candlelight. Around him, 50,000 Allied soldiers tried to sleep in the freezing cold, unaware that their next meal depended on a captured enemy cook and his ridiculous recipe. Hans Weber woke at 3 in the morning, 2 hours before dawn. The guard outside his tent looked surprised when Hans requested to start working immediately. Most prisoners tried to sleep as much as possible, but Hans had work to do, and time was running short. Captain Morrison had assigned him 12 Allied cooks to work with. When Hans entered the field kitchen tent, the men looked at him with suspicion and contempt. He was the enemy. Just weeks ago, they had been shooting at soldiers who wore the same uniform Hans wore. Now they were supposed to take orders from him. Sergeant Bill Cooper, the head cook, was a large man from Pennsylvania. He had been cooking for the army for 15 years. He crossed his arms and stared at Hans coldly. Let me make something clear, German, Cooper said. I am only doing this because Captain Morrison ordered it. I do not trust you, and I do not believe your garbage recipe will work. Hans nodded calmly. I understand. You do not have to trust me. You just have to follow the cooking steps exactly as I show you. The results will speak for themselves. We will see about that, Cooper muttered. Hans spread out his notebook on a wooden table. The pages were filled with measurements, temperatures, and timing instructions. Everything was written in precise detail. He had spent 2 years perfecting these methods on the Eastern Front, where German supply lines were constantly under attack. First, we need to gather ingredients, Hans said. Sergeant Cooper, please bring me all the potato peels from yesterday and today. Also, any stale bread that you plan to throw away. Cooper shook his head in disbelief, but did as instructed. Within an hour, they had collected buckets of potato peels and several bags of hard bread that was 3 days old. Now we go outside, Hans said. We need to gather plants. 2 guards accompanied Hans and 3 cooks into the frozen forest near the camp. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Hans moved through the trees with surprising confidence. He pushed aside snow and pointed to various plants. This is wild garlic, he said, pulling up a plant with green shoots. In winter, it grows close to tree roots where the ground is warmer. It adds flavor and helps digestion. He showed them yarrow, winter cress, and chickweed. The Allied cooks were amazed. These plants were everywhere, but they had never noticed them before. In the siege of Leningrad, people ate these plants to survive, Hans explained as they gathered. A Russian chef taught me which ones are safe and nutritious. He said that nature provides food, even in winter, but you must know where to look. Back in the kitchen, Hans began the cooking process. He filled enormous pots with water and set them over fires. The water had to reach exactly 80 degrees Celsius, not boiling. He used a thermometer to check constantly. Why not boiling? Cooper asked, despite himself becoming curious. Boiling destroys nutrients, Hans explained. This temperature is hot enough to cook, but gentle enough to preserve vitamins and minerals. Every degree matters when you have limited food. Hans added the potato peels first. He had taught the cooks to wash them thoroughly 3 times. Many people did not know that potato peels contain more nutrients than the potato flesh itself. Then came the stale bread, which he had soaked in water to soften. The wild herbs went in next, along with bones from previous meals that would have been thrown away. Hans explained that bones released minerals and marrow when simmered slowly. He added a small amount of actual meat, rationed carefully, and some preserved vegetables. The cooking process took 4 hours. During that time, Hans taught the Allied cooks about layering. Each ingredient went in at a specific time and temperature. The order mattered. The timing mattered. Everything was precise. As morning turned to afternoon, an aroma began filling the camp. Soldiers walking past the kitchen tent stopped and sniffed the air. They looked confused. Whatever was cooking smelled delicious, nothing like the usual army food. "What is that smell?" soldiers asked each other. "The German prisoner is cooking," someone answered. "That is what we are eating today? Food made by a Nazi," another soldier said with disgust. Word spread quickly through the camp. By noon, when mealtime arrived, 5,000 soldiers lined up with their mess kits. Most expected terrible food. Some were angry about eating anything made by a German. Others were just hungry enough not to care. Hans and his team filled the first soldier's kit. The man looked down at his food with suspicion. It looked like a thick stew, brown and steaming. He took a small, careful bite. His eyes widened. "This is actually good," he said with surprise. The soldier behind him laughed. "You are just hungry enough to eat anything." But when that second soldier tasted the food, he also stopped. Then the third soldier. And the fourth. Within minutes, the complaints stopped. Soldiers were eating silently, then coming back for seconds. By military rules, seconds were only allowed if there was extra food. Hans had made sure there was plenty. Sergeant Cooper tasted the stew himself. He chewed slowly, his expression changing from skepticism to shock. The food was genuinely delicious. It was hearty and filling, with a complex flavor that came from the herbs. The texture was perfect, not too thick and not too thin. "I do not understand," Cooper said to Hans. "This should not work. These are scraps and weeds. How does it taste this good?" Hans smiled slightly. "Because we treated the scraps with respect. We used science and care. Food does not have to be expensive to be good. It just has to be cooked properly." By evening, all 5,000 soldiers had eaten. Captain Morrison visited the medical tent, expecting complaints of stomach problems. But the medical officer reported 0 cases of illness. In fact, soldiers were reporting that they felt full and energized. Morrison found Hans cleaning the kitchen equipment. The German cook looked exhausted but satisfied. "I do not know how you did this," Morrison said. "But it worked. Can you do this every day? Can you scale it up to 50,000 soldiers?" Hans wiped his hands on his apron. "Yes, Captain. Give me more cooks to train and more pots to work with. I can feed your entire army." Morrison made his decision. Starting tomorrow, Hans Weber would become the most important prisoner in the Allied camp. 1 week later, the Allied camp had transformed into the strangest kitchen operation anyone had ever seen. Hans Weber stood in the center of it all, directing 20 cooking teams like a conductor leading an orchestra. Each team had 5 cooks. Each team had massive pots, thermometers, and Hans's handwritten instructions. Captain Morrison had given Hans everything he requested. More captured German cooks had been brought in from other prison camps. Hans trained them alongside Allied cooks, teaching both sides to work together. At first, the two groups barely spoke to each other. But hunger and necessity broke down barriers faster than politics ever could. The results were stunning. Hans's recipe was now feeding 50,000 soldiers every single day. Supply officers checked their inventory reports 3 times because the numbers seemed impossible. Food usage had dropped by 60%. Warehouses that should have been empty still had supplies. The army was using less food but feeding more soldiers. Soldiers started calling the meals Weber's Miracle Stew. Men who had complained about army food for years now looked forward to mealtime. The food was not fancy, but it was filling, tasty, and made them feel strong. Some soldiers even wrote letters home describing the strange German cook who had saved them from hunger. News of Hans's success spread to other military units. Commanders from different divisions sent requests for the recipe. A general from the British forces visited personally to observe the cooking process. He watched in amazement as Hans's teams turned what looked like garbage into meals that soldiers actually wanted to eat. But not everyone was happy about Hans's success. Major Robert Hendricks commanded supply operations for a different Allied division 30 miles away. He was a career military man who believed in doing things by the book. Rules and regulations were sacred to him. When he heard that Morrison was using a German prisoner to feed troops, Hendricks was outraged. "This is completely irregular," Hendricks complained to his staff. "We cannot trust a German with our food supply. What if he is poisoning our soldiers slowly? What if this is all part of some Nazi plan?" His aide, Lieutenant Walsh, tried to reason with him. "Sir, the soldiers are healthy. Medical reports show no problems. In fact, the troops are in better condition than before." "I do not care about reports," Hendricks snapped. "This violates every protocol. A prisoner of war should not be given this much freedom and responsibility." But Hendricks had another reason for his anger, one he would not admit out loud. He was jealous. Morrison's division was succeeding while Hendricks's own division struggled with food shortages. Morrison was receiving praise from high command while Hendricks received criticism. It was humiliating. Hendricks decided to take action. He sent a formal complaint to headquarters, demanding an investigation into Hans Weber and his cooking methods. He claimed there were serious concerns about food safety and security risks. 2 days later, military police arrived at Morrison's camp with orders to shut down Hans's kitchen operation immediately, pending investigation. Morrison was furious, but orders were orders. Hans was placed under heavy guard. His cooking teams were disbanded. The special ingredients and methods were forbidden. The army went back to standard cooking procedures with standard rations. Within 24 hours, the difference was obvious. Soldiers complained that the regular food was bland and unsatisfying. They needed larger portions to feel full, which meant supplies ran out faster. Morale dropped noticeably. Some soldiers even refused to eat. On the third day, without Hans's cooking, something unexpected happened. A group of 200 soldiers marched to Captain Morrison's headquarters. They were not armed, but their faces were angry and determined. Sergeant Bill Cooper, who had once distrusted Hans, was leading them. "Captain Morrison, sir, we want to make a statement," Cooper said firmly. Morrison stepped outside his tent. "What is this about, Sergeant?" "It is about our food, sir. The soldiers want Weber back in the kitchen. We all do. We have been eating that German's cooking for a week, and we know it works. The food we are getting now is garbage compared to what he made." Other soldiers shouted their agreement. "Bring back Weber," someone yelled. "We want the miracle stew." Morrison held up his hands for quiet. "I understand your concerns, but there is an official investigation. My hands are tied until it is completed." "Then complete it faster," Cooper said. "Because if you do not, you are going to have bigger problems than food shortages. The men are talking about refusing to eat entirely until Weber is back." Morrison knew a potential mutiny when he saw one. He immediately sent urgent messages to headquarters explaining the situation. The investigation committee, which had been moving slowly, suddenly accelerated their schedule. The investigation team arrived 2 days later. They interviewed Hans extensively, asking him dozens of questions about his background, his methods, and his intentions. They tested the food ingredients. They examined the cooking procedures. They reviewed medical reports from the past week. Hans answered every question honestly and completely. He showed them his notebooks with recipes and scientific explanations. He explained the principles of nutrient preservation and efficient cooking. He told them about the chef from Leningrad who had taught him these methods. Major Hendricks attended the investigation, making accusation after accusation. "This man is a German soldier," he said. "We cannot trust him. His cooking methods are suspicious. Using wild plants? Cooking at specific temperatures? This could all be a cover for something sinister." The chief investigator, Colonel Barnes, was a practical man who had seen much of the war. He listened to Hendricks carefully, then turned to Hans. "Mr. Weber, why are you doing this? Why help feed enemy soldiers?" Hans was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion. "My son was a soldier, Colonel. He was captured on the Eastern Front and sent to a Soviet prisoner camp. He died there 6 months ago. He starved to death because there was not enough food." The room became silent. "When I learned about his death, I made a decision," Hans continued. "No soldier, regardless of what uniform he wears, should die from hunger if I can prevent it. War makes us enemies on the battlefield, but hunger makes us all the same. We are just men who need food to survive." Colonel Barnes studied Hans's face for a long moment. Then he looked at Major Hendricks. "Major, I understand your concerns, but sometimes we must put aside our prejudices for the greater good. This man is helping us win the war by keeping our soldiers fed and strong." The investigation continued for 3 more days. Military nutritionists arrived from headquarters, bringing scientific equipment and skeptical attitudes. They were determined to understand exactly how Hans Weber's recipe worked. Something that seemed too good to be true usually was. Dr. Elizabeth Chun led the nutrition team. She was a civilian scientist who had been studying military food efficiency since the war began. She had a sharp mind and no patience for nonsense. When she heard about Hans's methods, she suspected fraud or exaggeration. "Show me everything," she told Hans on the first morning. "Every ingredient, every temperature, every step." I want to understand the complete process. Hans took her through his methods step by step. He explained how potato peels contained fiber and potassium that the potato flesh lacked. He showed her the wild plants and described their nutritional content. He demonstrated the precise cooking temperatures and timing. Dr. Chun took samples at each stage. She tested the raw ingredients, the cooking process, and the final product. Her team ran chemical analyses to measure proteins, vitamins, minerals, and calories. They worked through the night, filling notebooks with data. On the second day, Dr. Chun called Colonel Barnes to review her findings. Major Hendricks insisted on attending, certain that the investigation would finally expose Hans as a fraud. "Gentlemen," Dr. Chun began, "I have completed my analysis of Mr. Weber's cooking methods. The results are remarkable." She spread charts and graphs across the table. "First, let me explain what he is doing. Mr. Weber uses a scientific principle called nutrient extraction. When he cooks at 80 degrees Celsius instead of boiling, he is preserving heat-sensitive vitamins that would normally be destroyed." She pointed to another chart. "The layering method he uses is also scientifically sound. By adding ingredients at specific times, he maximizes nutrient absorption while minimizing waste. The bones release calcium and minerals through slow simmering. The wild herbs contain compounds that aid digestion, which means the body absorbs more nutrition from less food." Colonel Barnes leaned forward. "So the food is actually nutritious? This is not just filling stomachs with empty calories." "Correct," Dr. Chun confirmed. "In fact, soldiers eating Mr. Weber's food are receiving better nutrition than they were getting from standard rations. The blood tests we conducted show improved vitamin levels and better overall health markers." Major Hendricks frowned. "But how did a German field cook learn all this science? This seems too sophisticated for a simple cook." Hans, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, spoke up. "I told you, Major. I learned from a chef who survived the siege of Leningrad. May I tell you his story?" Colonel Barnes nodded. "Please do." Hans took a breath, remembering. In 1941, the German army surrounded Leningrad. The siege lasted nearly 900 days. It was one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history. Over 1 million people died, most from starvation. The city was cut off from all supplies. Everyone in the room knew about Leningrad. It was one of the war's greatest tragedies. In 1943, I was stationed near the region after the siege ended. Hans continued. Our unit captured a Soviet supply depot. Among the prisoners was an old chef named Viktor Petrov. He was barely alive, just skin and bones. But he had survived the entire siege. Hans's voice grew softer. Viktor was dying. Our doctors could not save him. He knew this. In his final days, he taught me everything he had learned about survival cooking. He said that knowledge should not die with him. He taught me which plants could be eaten, how to extract maximum nutrition from minimum food, how to cook scientifically to preserve every vitamin. Why would he teach you? Hendricks asked suspiciously. You were his enemy. Because I showed him kindness, Hans replied simply. I gave him my own food rations. I sat with him when he was alone. When you are facing death, national flags do not matter anymore. Victor wanted his knowledge to help people, any people. He said that the real enemy was not German or Russian. The real enemy was hunger itself. The room was silent. Even Hendricks seemed moved by the story. Dr. Chin cleared her throat and continued her presentation. Regardless of where Mr. Weber learned these methods, they are scientifically valid. I have documented everything in my report. This cooking system could revolutionize military food preparation. She showed them calculations. If we implement Mr. Weber's methods across all Allied forces, we could reduce food consumption by 50% while actually improving soldier health. This would free up enormous resources. Ships carrying food could carry ammunition instead. Supply lines would be under less strain. Colonel Barnes understood immediately. This could help us win the war faster. Precisely, Dr. Chin agreed. Food logistics is one of our biggest challenges. Mr. Weber has solved a problem that our best scientists have been struggling with for years. She turned to Hans. Mr. Weber, where did you learn to be so precise with temperatures and timing? This is not standard cooking knowledge. Hans smiled slightly. Before the war, I worked in Vienna under a chef named Auguste Reynard. He was French, but worked all over Europe. He believed that cooking was a science as much as an art. He taught me to measure everything, to understand why each step mattered. When Viktor Petrov taught me his survival methods, I applied Auguste's scientific approach to them. That is how I developed these recipes. Major Hendricks had been growing quieter as the investigation progressed. Now he stood up, his face red. I still say this is wrong. This man is a German soldier. He fought for Hitler. How can we reward him? Hans met his eyes directly. Major, I never fought for Hitler. I was a cook. I fed soldiers because soldiers must eat. That is all I ever did. I did not choose this war. None of us did. But I can choose how I act within it. Colonel Barnes made his decision. The investigation is concluded. Mr. Weber is cleared of all suspicion. His cooking methods are approved for immediate implementation across all units. Major Hendricks, your objections are noted but overruled. Hendricks's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Furthermore, Barnes continued, Mr. Weber's methods will be documented in detail and distributed to all Allied military kitchens. Dr. Chun, I want you to work with Mr. Weber to create a training manual. That evening, Hans returned to his kitchen. The cooking teams cheered when they saw him. Even Sergeant Cooper shook his hand. Welcome back, Weber, Cooper said with a genuine smile. We missed you. Hans nodded, touched by the gesture. 3 weeks ago, these men had been his enemies. Now they were his colleagues, perhaps even his friends. But Hans knew the truth. War made people enemies. But working together, sharing knowledge, and feeding the hungry could make them human again. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book written by war itself. The seasons changed from winter to spring, and the war moved forward with terrible momentum. By May 1944, Allied forces were preparing for major operations that would change the course of history. The invasion of Normandy was just weeks away, though few soldiers knew it yet. Hans Weber's recipe had spread across the Allied armies like wildfire. What started as a desperate solution in one camp was now standard procedure in dozens of military kitchens. The training manual that Dr. Chun and Hans created together had been distributed to every division. Thousands of cooks learned his methods. The food savings were even better than predicted, allowing the military to redirect resources to weapons, medicine, and transportation. Some historians would later say that Hans's contribution shortened the war by helping solve one of the military's biggest logistical challenges. Others would call this exaggeration, but everyone agreed that his recipe had fed millions of soldiers and saved countless lives from hunger. Hans himself had changed during these months. He was no longer just a prisoner. Captain Morrison had given him a special status, something between prisoner and civilian contractor. He had freedom to move around the camp, though always with a guard nearby. He had become something rare in war, a man without clear enemies. Soldiers who once called him the German now called him Hans or Chef Weber. They told him about their families back home. They shared jokes and cigarettes with him. They thanked him for the food that kept them strong. But Hans never forgot that he was still a prisoner. He slept in a guarded tent. He could not leave the camp. His country was losing the war, and he did not know if he would ever see Germany again. He had no family left to return to anyway. His son was dead. His wife had died before the war from illness. He was alone in the world except for the strange community he had built in this military kitchen. In early May, Captain Morrison called Hans to his office. The captain looked serious but not unkind. Hans, I have news, Morrison said. The war in Europe is moving toward its conclusion. Germany is losing on all fronts. Most people believe it will be over within a year, maybe less. Hans nodded. He had heard the rumors. I am not surprised, Captain. Germany cannot win against so many enemies. That brings me to an important question, Morrison continued. What will you do when the war ends? You will be released from prisoner status, but returning to Germany will be difficult. The country will be in ruins. There will be chaos and starvation. Hans had thought about this many times. I do not know, Captain. I suppose I will go where I am needed. Morrison leaned forward. I have a proposal for you. High Command is planning for post-war reconstruction. Europe will need food systems rebuilt. Millions of civilians will be hungry. They want to establish teams that will help restore agriculture and food distribution in destroyed areas. He pulled out a document. They are offering you a position. You would travel to war-torn regions and teach local people your cooking methods. You would help set up community kitchens. You would train others to feed people efficiently with limited resources. Hans stared at the document. They want me to do this? A German. They want someone who knows how to feed people when there is almost nothing to work with, Morrison said. You are the best person for that job. Your nationality does not matter when people are starving." Hans picked up the document with shaking hands. It offered him purpose, a way to use his knowledge to help instead of just survive. "I accept," he said quietly. "When do I start?" "Soon," Morrison replied. "But first, there is something else." The next day, Hans was called to a special ceremony. Soldiers from multiple divisions gathered in the camp's main assembly area. Hans walked to the front, confused and nervous. Colonel Barnes stood waiting with several other high-ranking officers. "Hans Weber," Colonel Barnes announced in a loud voice. "You are being recognized for exceptional service in support of Allied forces. Your innovative cooking methods have fed over 2 million soldiers and saved immeasurable resources." He held up a certificate of commendation, an honor rarely given to prisoners of war. "This recognition comes from Allied High Command. While you wore an enemy uniform, you acted with compassion and scientific innovation that transcended national boundaries." The soldiers applauded. Hans felt tears in his eyes. He had spent 2 years of war just trying to do his job, to cook food and keep people alive. He never expected recognition, especially not from the people he had technically been fighting against. Sergeant Bill Cooper stepped forward and shook Hans's hand firmly. "You taught us more than cooking, Weber. You taught us that even in war, people can work together." As spring turned to summer, Hans began his new work. The war was entering its final phase. Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. Hans traveled with reconstruction teams, staying behind the advancing armies to help feed displaced civilians in a destroyed French village. Hans set up a community kitchen. Local people, who had been living on scraps for months, watched skeptically as this German man began teaching them to cook. He showed them the same methods he had taught Allied soldiers: how to use wild plants, how to preserve nutrients, how to make nourishing meals from almost nothing. An old French woman named Marie was the first to try the food. She had lost her husband and 2 sons in the war. She had every reason to hate Germans. But when she tasted the soup Hans made, she began to cry. "This is good," she said in French. Hans understood enough to know her meaning. "This is real food." Other villagers came forward, their hunger overcoming their hatred. Hans taught them patiently, writing down recipes in French with help from a translator. Within a week, the village had its own functioning kitchen, run by local people using Hans's methods. Hans moved from village to village, from France to Belgium to Holland. Everywhere he went, he saw the same thing: hungry people who needed help more than they needed to hold grudges. He worked alongside former enemies, teaching and learning. A British nutritionist named Sarah joined his team, helping document and improve his methods. They became close friends, united by their mission to fight hunger. By early 1945, as the war finally ended in Europe, Hans had helped establish over 50 community kitchens across liberated territories. His methods were being taught in schools. His recipes were being printed in newspapers. One evening in June 1945, just after Germany's surrender, Hans sat outside a small kitchen in a German village that had been bombed to rubble. He was finally back in his homeland. But it was not the Germany he remembered. The country was destroyed, defeated, occupied. Millions were homeless and hungry. A young German boy, maybe 10 years old, approached him shyly. The boy was thin and dirty, clearly an orphan surviving alone. "Sir," the boy said in German, "I heard you teach people to cook. Can you teach me? I am very hungry, and I want to learn how to find food." Hans looked at the child and saw his own son's face. He saw all the children of this terrible war, the ones who survived but lost everything. He felt the weight of all the loss and all the hope for the future. "Yes," Hans said gently, "I will teach you. Sit down." He began showing the boy how to identify edible plants, how to cook with limited supplies, how to make something nourishing from what others might throw away. As he taught, he remembered Viktor Petrov, the Russian chef who had taught him during the siege. Knowledge passed from person to person, crossing borders and conflicts. "Remember this," Hans told the boy as they cooked together. "Food has no flag. A hungry person is just a hungry person, not German or French or Russian. When you feed someone, you are not taking sides. You are just being human." The boy nodded seriously, stirring the pot as Hans had shown him. Hans looked up at the evening sky. The war was over, but his work was just beginning. There were millions more to feed, millions more to teach. His ridiculous recipe, the one that officers had mocked and investigators had doubted, was now feeding people across Europe. Sometimes, Hans thought, the most important victories were not won on battlefields, but in kitchens where strangers became neighbors over a shared meal.